Littleton, Colorado, on October 4th, 2008. The Malik family had lived here for nearly a decade, blending into the peaceful rhythm of the neighborhood. Layla Malik, a 36-year-old mother of two and devoted wife, was known for her warmth and kindness. To her friends, she was the perfect image of family loyalty and dedication. But that October evening, Layla was distracted, her mind miles away. Her husband, Omar, ran a small but successful auto repair shop on the outskirts of town. Layla sometimes helped with bookkeeping, and every so often she would drop by the shop just to check on things. Lately, though, her visits had become more frequent, and she stayed longer than usual. Layla's reason: a new hire. His name was Kyle Thompson, a 24-year-old mechanic with a rough exterior but a charm that couldn't be ignored. Kyle was the kind of person who made an impression. He had arrived in Littleton that summer, fresh from a series of odd jobs across different states, and had quickly become popular among the locals. Tall and rugged, with an air of mystery, Kyle had a way of making anyone feel like they were the only person in the room. Layla first met him in late August, when she stopped by the shop to drop off some paperwork. It was just a brief interaction, a quick introduction. But from that moment, she couldn't shake the strange feeling he gave her, a mix of curiosity and excitement. She was drawn to him, as if he'd unlocked something in her she didn't know she had. It felt wrong, and she told herself it was just a passing thought, an innocent spark. But as the weeks passed, Layla found herself creating excuses to visit the shop more often. She'd bring coffee for the team, offer to help with the accounting, or stop by under the pretense of needing car advice. Each time, her heart would race a little faster, anticipation building with every visit. By mid-September, their conversations had moved beyond small talk. They shared stories about life, dreams, and regrets. Kyle was quick to listen, and Layla found herself confiding in him about things she hadn't told anyone. He was the opposite of Omar, carefree, spontaneous, and unburdened by responsibility. It was a side of life she'd forgotten, buried under years of stability and duty. On September 30th, Layla stayed at the shop after hours, helping Kyle with some paperwork. They worked in silence, the quiet tension filling the room. Eventually, their eyes met, and in that brief moment, words weren't needed. They both felt it, the forbidden pull that neither could ignore. And that night, the line between them blurred in ways that would change everything. October 10th, 2008, Littleton, Colorado. It had only been a few days since that night in the auto shop, but for Layla and Kyle, everything felt different. Each time she glanced at her phone, she hoped for a message from him, a simple text that would light up her day. It was intoxicating, the secrecy and thrill of it all. Layla was no longer the quiet wife who helped around the shop. She felt alive, as if she'd been pulled out from under the weight of a life that, until now, had felt like an endless routine. Omar, unaware of what was happening, noticed that something was off with Layla. She seemed happier, more energetic, and spent more time dressing up and paying attention to her appearance. He assumed it was a new phase, a fresh start for her, perhaps due to the change of season. He had no reason to doubt her. They'd been married for nearly 15 years, and she had always been devoted. But behind closed doors, Layla's emotions were in turmoil. She struggled with the guilt, aware that her actions could shatter everything she and Omar had built. She loved her children, their home, and even Omar in her own way. But something about Kyle's carefree spirit and his willingness to listen filled an emptiness she'd tried to ignore for years. On October 15th, Layla found herself at the shop once again, long after closing time. She'd told Omar she was helping out with some bookkeeping, a task that she was fully capable of doing from home. But Kyle was there, and she couldn't resist. She watched him work, the ease with which he handled every tool, his confidence with each repair. They exchanged glances, and with every glance the tension between them grew. He was aware of her gaze, and she knew he felt the same pull. She felt alive, and the attraction was undeniable. They began spending time together outside the shop, carefully avoiding any spots where they might run into people they knew. Quiet trails in nearby parks, late-night drives, and sometimes just sitting in his truck, talking until dawn. Every time Layla was with Kyle, she felt like a new person, free of the constraints that had bound her for so long. By the end of October, the affair had become as much a part of her life as her role as a mother and wife. Layla was living in two worlds. At home, she was still the doting wife, making dinner, helping the kids with homework, and attending community events with Omar. But with Kyle, she was someone else, a woman who felt seen, desired, and understood. They shared everything, secrets, stories, dreams, and fears, and with each secret shared, her connection to Omar grew weaker. On November 2nd, she found herself slipping out of the house after midnight, with Omar fast asleep. She drove to a secluded part of town where Kyle was waiting for her. Under the dim glow of streetlights, they sat in silence, the world around them asleep. In the quiet, Layla confessed what she'd been holding back. "I don't know if I can keep doing this, Kyle," she said softly. "This feels dangerous." Kyle reached for her hand, his touch warm against the cold air. "I know it's risky, but I can't stop," he replied, his voice barely a whisper. "I've never felt this way about anyone." They sat there, their hands intertwined, the weight of their words filling the car. Layla knew the risk was real, that any wrong move could expose their secret. She thought about Omar, about the children, about the life they'd built. She was torn, unable to decide which life was more important to her, the one she'd built with Omar or the one she was creating with Kyle. But the more she tried to distance herself from Kyle, the harder it became. Every time she was near him, her resolve weakened. The forbidden nature of their relationship only made it more thrilling, the danger heightening every moment they shared. By mid-November, Layla's visits to the shop became less frequent. She knew the neighbors were starting to notice. She couldn't afford any rumors, any whisper that might reach Omar, but despite her efforts, a shadow of doubt was already creeping into her life. Omar began coming home earlier, asking her about her day, pressing for details he'd once overlooked. He was suspicious, though she could tell he wasn't ready to admit it, even to himself. On November 20th, Layla received a text from Kyle asking her to meet him that evening. He sounded urgent, saying he needed to see her. Ignoring the gnawing feeling of doubt, she agreed, slipping out of the house under the guise of running an errand. They met in a remote parking lot, just as the first hints of winter crept into the air. "I can't keep doing this in the shadows," Kyle said, his voice filled with frustration. "I need you, Layla. We can make this work." Layla's heart pounded, torn between the safety of her life with Omar and the pull of Kyle's words. She didn't respond right away, her mind racing. She knew that what they had was unsustainable, a ticking time bomb waiting to explode. But even as she stood there, her heart felt that undeniable connection to him, a bond she couldn't simply break. What Layla didn't know was that their world was on the brink of unraveling. November 25th. Thanksgiving was around the corner, and Layla found herself struggling to keep up with the facade. Each time she looked at Omar, guilt twisted inside her. She told herself she would end things with Kyle, that this was the last time. But every time she saw him, those promises dissolved. The weight of her double life was beginning to show, and it didn't take long for Omar to notice the cracks. Omar wasn't one to jump to conclusions, but he was an observant man. He noticed how Layla was suddenly quiet at home, her phone always within reach, her glances at him filled with an unease he couldn't ignore. She was there, physically, but her mind seemed miles away. For weeks, he tried to brush it off, assuming it was just stress or a phase, but a gut feeling told him something was wrong. and Omar wasn't a man to ignore his instincts. One evening, while Layla was putting the kids to bed, Omar decided to act on his suspicions. He went through her phone, hoping to reassure himself that everything was fine. But there it was, a trail of messages and missed calls, all from the same contact. Kay. Reading through the texts, a sickening realization hit him. The words were careful and cryptic, but the messages between them were filled with a closeness that left no room for doubt. Later that night, Omar confronted Layla. She was caught off guard, unable to hide the guilt that had been festering inside her for weeks. There was a moment of silence, heavy and suffocating, as he waited for her to explain herself. "Who is he, Layla?" Omar's voice was cold, his eyes hardened with hurt and anger. She wanted to deny it, to convince him it was nothing, but she knew there was no way out. "It's not what you think," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I never meant for any of this to happen. It just got out of control." Omar's face twisted with disbelief. "Got out of control? You were sneaking around with another man. That's more than out of control, Layla." She tried to reach for him, to somehow make him understand, but he pushed her away. The betrayal cut deeper than she had imagined, and the look in Omar's eyes was enough to tell her that nothing she said would make it right. In the following days, the tension in their home became unbearable. Omar was a quiet storm, simmering with anger, but refusing to talk about it. Layla, consumed by guilt and shame, found herself retreating further into silence, unable to face what she had done. And despite the mess, she couldn't shake her feelings for Kyle. The thrill, the forbidden connection, it was still there, pulling her toward him, even as her marriage lay in ruins. Meanwhile, Omar's anger was building. He wasn't the kind of man to let things slide, especially not this. He began doing his own quiet investigation, gathering details about Kyle. He learned that Kyle was the young mechanic his wife had grown close to, the one who had recently started working at the shop. The pieces were falling into place, and with every new detail, Omar's anger deepened. On December 3rd, Omar made a decision. He went to the shop after hours, hoping to confront Kyle. But the shop was dark and empty, the only sound the soft hum of the heaters that kept the garage warm. Omar stood there for a long moment, anger simmering just below the surface. He knew he'd have to wait, but he was determined to confront Kyle face to face. The next day, Omar confronted Layla one last time, demanding she end things with Kyle immediately. For a moment, she thought about fighting back, but she couldn't deny the fear she saw in Omar's eyes. She knew he was serious, that this was a breaking point, and so she agreed. But even as she promised to cut ties, she felt a pang of loss, as if a part of her was slipping away forever. That evening she met Kyle one final time to break things off. They met in a secluded spot, far from prying eyes, where she could say goodbye without interruption. But emotions ran high, and the farewell turned into another embrace. One last attempt to hold on to the world they'd built together in secret. Layla didn't know how to let him go, and Kyle wasn't ready to lose her either. They parted that night, both feeling the weight of the decision, each promising to stay away, even though they both knew it would be nearly impossible. But Omar was already onto them. He had been watching, following Layla's every move, determined to uncover the truth and ensure this affair came to an end. The realization of their final meeting that evening left him reeling, his anger now fueled by a betrayal he had never anticipated. Layla was completely unaware of the storm brewing around her, unaware that the consequences of her actions would soon come crashing down in a way neither she nor Kyle could escape. December 5th. As winter settled over Littleton, an icy silence filled the Malik household. The final confrontation between Omar and Layla had left them in a state of uneasy truce. Layla went through her days in a daze, carrying on as if everything was normal, yet haunted by a gnawing sense of dread. She had promised Omar she would end things with Kyle, but the tension in her home was thick, her husband's mistrust casting a dark shadow over everything. But Omar wasn't done. The betrayal had shattered him, transforming his hurt into something darker, something that wouldn't let him rest. He wanted answers, a sense of control over a situation that had blindsided him. And the only way he saw fit to resolve it was to confront Kyle himself, once and for all. On the morning of December 7th, Omar tracked down Kyle's address and decided to pay him a visit. He told Layla he had to make a quick run to the shop for inventory and left without another word. Layla, feeling the strain of the past few weeks, thought little of it. She took the quiet morning as an opportunity to clear her mind, unaware of what was set in motion. Omar arrived at Kyle's small apartment on the edge of town, his fists clenched as he knocked on the door. When Kyle opened it and saw Omar standing there, he froze. He had sensed trouble might come, but seeing Omar face to face brought a new reality crashing down. Omar's expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a fury that was unmistakable. "We need to talk," Omar said, his voice low and controlled. Kyle, feeling cornered, nodded and stepped back, allowing Omar to enter. The two men sat across from each other in the cramped living room, an uncomfortable silence stretching between them. Omar took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. "You're going to stay away from my wife. You're going to disappear from her life, or there will be consequences," Omar said, his words sharp and unforgiving. Kyle stared at him, torn between anger and guilt. "Look, I never meant for any of this to happen," he started, his voice wavering. "But Layla, she deserves more than just being ignored. She deserves to be happy." Omar's face darkened. "You don't get to decide what she deserves. I'm her husband. I provide for her, for our children. I won't let some kid who barely knows her tear my family apart." Kyle stood up, his jaw set. "Maybe you'd know what she needs if you actually listened to her instead of just paying the bills." The words struck a nerve, and in an instant, Omar lunged forward, grabbing Kyle by the collar. Anger flared between them, the tension finally breaking as they grappled, the confrontation escalating with each passing second. Fueled by betrayal and rage, Omar's restraint snapped. The fight was brief but brutal, leaving Kyle bruised and gasping, and Omar with a newfound determination. Leaving Kyle's apartment, Omar felt a strange sense of satisfaction, but also a creeping realization. This was far from over. He could only control Layla and Kyle's interactions for so long. The bitterness remained, eating away at him, and he knew it wouldn't simply disappear. The next morning, on December 8th, Layla sensed something was wrong. Omar was unusually quiet, his mood colder than ever. She kept to herself, trying to stay out of his way, but the tension was palpable. Later that afternoon, Layla received a message from Kyle, telling her about Omar's visit, the confrontation, the threats. Her heart raced as she read the words. Fear and guilt consumed her, knowing she was putting both of them in danger. By the evening, she knew she had to see Kyle one last time, to make sure he was safe and that he understood the importance of keeping distance. She told Omar she was stepping out to run an errand and left the house, hoping to settle the matter once and for all. But Omar, driven by paranoia, decided to follow her. Unaware that Omar was trailing her, Layla arrived at Kyle's place. As she stepped inside, the weight of her actions settled over her, the realization that there was no way to resolve this without tearing her family apart. She looked at Kyle, his face still bruised from the fight with Omar, and a wave of guilt washed over her. "This has to stop, Kyle," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It's tearing my life apart. I can't do this anymore." Kyle looked at her, a mixture of hurt and desperation in his eyes. "You're just going to walk away after everything we've been through?" Layla nodded, her heart heavy. "I don't have a choice. Omar, he won't stop. He'll ruin you, and I can't let that happen. Before Kyle could respond, there was a loud bang on the door. Layla's heart stopped, and they both turned, fear flooding their expressions. Omar stood in the doorway, his face twisted with a fury that sent chills down her spine. "So this is it," Omar said, his voice barely a whisper. "All this time you were here with him, making a fool out of me." Layla moved toward Omar, hands raised, trying to calm him down. "Omar, please, just listen." But Omar was beyond listening. He pushed past her and lunged at Kyle, fists flying. The two men grappled, their anger spilling over in a chaotic clash. Layla screamed, begging them to stop, but her words were lost in the frenzy. In the struggle, Omar grabbed a nearby wrench from the counter and swung it at Kyle, striking him hard. Kyle fell to the ground, his body limp, the silence in the room deafening. Layla collapsed beside him, her hands shaking as she looked at what had happened. Omar stood over them, breathing heavily, the reality of his actions settling in with a terrifying clarity. The police arrived minutes later, called by a neighbor who heard the commotion. Omar was arrested on the spot, his face devoid of any emotion. Layla sat on the floor, numb, unable to comprehend the devastation that had unfolded in a matter of minutes. Kyle was gone, and her marriage, her family, her entire life lay in ruins. January 2009, Littleton, Colorado. The trial was swift. Omar was sentenced to prison, found guilty of manslaughter. The town of Littleton was left reeling, whispers of the tragic affair echoing through every corner. Layla, now a single mother, was left to pick up the pieces, haunted by the choices that had led to that night. She often found herself retracing the steps, wondering how it had come to this. How a spark, a small decision to seek something more, had ignited a fire that consumed everything she held dear.